With that, let me just start on this with, I'm very pleased to be able to sharing this panel with some terrific scholars. I think it's I'll introduce them very briefly. You have their bios, but in the order of their presentations. We're going to start with Jeremi Suri, whose latest...
There's a card you can hold. Here you go. Advertising.
It'll be forthcoming in September of this year, The Impossible Presidency, The Rise and Fall of America's Highest Office, with basic quotes. And I probably don't need to say anything more about Jeremi Suri. It's wonderful to have him here, and he's a terrifically energetic, and is wonderful at multitasking and all sorts of activities. Next we'll have Will Inboden will be speaking on Reagan, and actually he'll be talking about Kissinger and conservative internationalism.
Will, you're going to talk about Kissinger?
No,
No, I'm talking
you
about
are, and Will Inboden...
I just want me to give your talk.
Will Inboden is, in some ways we're all here, yes, Charlie, but especially Will Inboden. What he's created here at the University of Texas is just very, very impressive, and we all owe him a great deal of gratitude and gratitude. And I think it's a measure of Joshua Shifrinson, who's an assistant professor at the Bush School, and whose first book and was forthcoming, entitled Falling Giants, Rising States and the Fate of Declining Great Powers. And he'll be speaking about H.W. Bush, realist or conservative internationalist. And it's a tribute to Joshua that he's presenting on this panel with folks such as Jeremi and Will. And so this is a terrific panel, and I'm looking forward to their remarks and to your questions.
Well, I'm delighted to be here. I want to thank the entire Clements Center staff, especially my friend Will Inboden, but the entire staff. I want to thank all of my students who are here also. I mean, it's the end of the semester and they still show up. It's amazing. Amazing. So I'm going to talk about Henry Kissinger in particular, and I want to talk about Kissinger as representation of a particular way of thinking about conservative impulses in American foreign policy. I agree with Frank. I don't think there really is a usable category of conservative internationalism. My reasons for saying that are different from his, as will be evident to you. But the main reason that I want us to start with is not the internationalist side, but the conservative side. Conservatism as a concept is, of course, an old concept. It's a concept that by necessity refers to tradition, and by necessity refers to a skepticism about rapid change. You cannot be a conservative. And if you call yourself one and you think these things, you are not really a conservative if you believe in rapid change and if you do not believe in tradition. Tradition and slow change are fundamentally associated with conservatism in the etymology of the concept, it seems to me. And where Henry Kissinger comes into this story, it seems to me, is he brings a particular connection to long-established European conservative ideas into the American political establishment. At different times, he calls himself a conservative or not, depending on who's president and who he's kissing up to. But nonetheless, the conservative qualities in his thought are quintessentially European conservative qualities. And if nothing else, and this is one of the areas where Neil Ferguson and I agree, there are many areas where we disagree, but one of the qualities that Kissinger plays, one of the roles he plays in the American foreign policy establishment, is bringing these European conservative ideas into mainstream thinking. He doesn't always follow through on them himself. He doesn't always embody them accurately. There are many fair criticisms of the way he defines these ideas and the ways he puts them into practice. But as an act of intellectual history, we can see in Kissinger a bridge from these European conservative ideas into the American policy establishment. You could argue to some extent, as Charlie did, in fact, that Theodore Roosevelt does a little bit of this, but Kissinger is the most self-conscious one of this kind. If Kennan is a Victorian conservative, Kissinger is a quintessentially continental European conservative in a lot of his thinking. He's deeply motivated, deeply influenced from a very early period by his reading of Spengler, his reading of Burke, and his reading of Kant. And here's where I would differ from the idealistic readings of Kant that some have made, I've argued recently. It's not the Kant of perpetual peace. right? It's the content of the critique of pure reason. That's actually crucial if you look at Kissinger's intellectual development. He gets these ideas actually through another set of German intellectuals who come to the United States and are influential in the nexus between intellectual and policy-making activities in the Clements centers of the 1940s. And these are figures like Hans Morgenthau and Carl Friedrich. In fact, you can see a direct line from the Spenglers and Burkes of Europe to the Morgenthaus and Friedrichs to the Henry Kissingers. And Kissinger is in fact a student of Friedrich, and if you go back, as I have and others have as well, and you trace Kissinger's intellectual development, Carl Friedrich stands out as one of the two most significant individual influences upon his life. What do these conservative ideas mean for Kissinger? Why does he adopt them? As a young man anxious to get involved in the policy world, deeply concerned about what he sees as the spiraling disorder and violence of the modern world, conservative ideas offer for him, as they did for many other Orthodox Jews at the time, they offer a ballast in the world. They offer a way of controlling change. They offer a way of maintaining order in a world that he believes is rapidly spiraling out of control. His consistent interpretation of the rise of fascism is that it is a crisis of modernity. And conservatism is not an alternative to modernity. Conservatism is a way of slowing, managing, controlling, and disciplining modernity, fundamentally. The ideas that he takes of European conservative ideas run against two things, right? We can define them by what they are not. They are defined in their opposition to Wilsonianism. He will later in life associate himself with Reagan and certain Wilsonian ideas, but you should not believe that that was there before that time, because it wasn't. In fact, it wasn't there even when Reagan was president. It was only there after Reagan had been president. And I'm sure Will comment on this too. You see quite a lot of hostility between the two true Reagan people and the Kissinger thinkers for that very reason. For that very reason. Reagan is a Wilsonian, as I think will agree. Kissinger is not. Kissinger sees Wilsonianism in the same way other conservatives did, as a idealistic, naive, and fundamentally ahistorical way of seeing the world. It is unrooted from tradition, doesn't understand the traditions within societies that limit the universalistic claims that Wilsonianism purports. Right? Now, whether Wilson himself actually fully believed those universalist claims is another story. The Wilsonian ideological type itself certainly makes that argument within American politics in the 1940s and 50s. He also, Kissinger does, sets himself against Kennan and containment. He sees containment in the same ways, and if you read his writings in the 50s and 60s, it's evident. He sees containment in the same ways that Walter Lippmann does. He and Lippmann adopt the same critique of containment, which is that containment in its practice is too static, it's too reactive, it is not conservative nor liberal, it's reactionary, as he sees it. And he at times will in fact call George Kennan a reactionary. It's quite interesting, in fact, in their long careers that overlap and run parallel. As far as I can tell, Henry Kissinger and George Kennan meet each other only 3 times. It's actually pretty extraordinary. If you think that they both live as long as they live, run in a lot of the same circles, it gives us a sense of how the networks of policymaking are segmented, even in the 50s and 60s, right? It's not just a 1990s, 2000 phenomenon. For Kissinger, containment is too reactive. Containment does not provide the ability to bring tradition and wisdom to policy, but instead puts the United States in a reactive position. He makes this case most significantly in the late 1950s when he argues for the United States appealing to the Soviet Union for a deal to end the Cold War. It's an argument he makes from 1955 to 1959 that in fact we missed an opportunity in 53 and we should come back to that opportunity. There are traditional interests the US and Russia have, and we can manage these interests. He will make the same argument, the same claim to President George H.W. Bush in 1989, 1990. Bat's book, wonderful book on Brent Scowcroft, actually talks about this, the Kissinger effort to kind of divide Europe at the end of the Cold War. So what are the conservative ideas, the European conservative ideas that Kissinger brings into American policymaking? If they're not about Wilsonianism and they're not about containment, I think there are really 4 areas we can point to. Of course, there's a lot more to say. This is a sort of short schematic of the things that at least I think are important in this. First, there's a deep belief in international hierarchy. Conservatism, European conservatism, in its Spenglerian and Burkean sense, is about a world of inequality, not a world of equality. A world defined by differences, not similarities. A world where there is not universalism, but instead particularism and hierarchy. And it is Carl Friedrich's great contribution, in fact, to the thinking of the second half of the 20th century to argue that there are federalist interpretations of international power and federalist structures of international power that could be used to manage the world. Kissinger thinks of the world in a federalist, lowercase f sense, not in a Hamiltonian federalist sense, but in a German federalist sense, of overlapping authorities and sovereignties in a hierarchical setting. American federalism, in its Madisonian Hamiltonian forms, tries to universalize and undermine hierarchy with overlapping sovereignty, right? So every state is equal, and every state has its own domain, and the federal government is there, but the federal government is not above or below the states, right? In a German sense, federalism operates with hierarchy and overlapping sovereignties. So you have some states, like Prussia, that are more powerful and influential than others, but there are still particular sovereign roles for other states within that structure. That's precisely how Friedrich and Kissinger thinks about the world. If you look at Kissinger's writings about détente, it is deeply embedded in this way of thinking. That all countries should have sovereignty, all countries should have say. It is a world of constituent elements, but there is a hierarchy and a structured process to the way these constituent elements relate to one another. He says this most clearly in German to Egon Bahr in one of their many disputes, where he basically says to Bahr, what you don't understand is that the Federal Republic is critical to the Atlantic Alliance, but it will always be in a secondary role to the United States' relationship with the Soviet Union. Right? That's a hierarchical way of thinking about German sovereignty within the context of overlapping hierarchical sovereignties. He sees the world in that way. I would argue he still sees the world in that way. Second element of conservative thought he brings in is the primacy, and this came up very well, I thought, in the first panel, the primacy of what European conservatives would call transatlantic values. Not just values per se, not American values, transatlantic values. What are these transatlantic values? They are values of community. They are values of civilization. And here there's a lot of overlap between Theodore Roosevelt and Henry Kissinger. The values of what would be called procedural democratic institutions versus substantive democratic outcomes, right? Conservative values are about the process of managing democratic contention rather than a focus upon what are seen as more American-focused outcomes. Kissinger says this repeatedly. The notion of the transatlantic community has a special purchase on particular ideas and particular ways of seeing these ideas are absolutely crucial. And by the way, this is what Kissinger and Konrad Adenauer spend most of their time talking about. Henry just actually published a piece, was it last week in the Wall Street Journal, where he actually made this point. It was really interesting. Once in a while, he still tells us interesting things, right? And in this piece, right, his argument was that Konrad Adenauer represented a pillar of a post-war civilization that the United States and Western Germany were building, right? It's the kind of Rundorf, Rhineland vision of Europe, where there's sort of French, German, British, American cooperation around institutions to manage coal and steel, institutions to manage joint military activities, all within a hierarchical setting of overlapping sovereignties, but a community acting as such. That's what European integration represents for these conservatives. It's very interesting and has been underanalyzed by Americans, the role of Christian Democrats in European integration. And in fact, the collapse of Christian democracy in the last 10 years and the rise of challenges, in fact, to European integration is very much the story of what we're seeing in Europe today. The role of Christian Democrats in seeing European community as something as transatlantic specialists, transatlantic exceptionalism, is a deep conservative idea going all the way back to Edmund Burke. Third point, polycentrism. This is actually, I think, Kissinger's most significant contribution himself as a theorist. The vision of the world not as bipolar, but as multipolar. Kissinger is one of the first major, not original, but influential thinkers in the late 50s to be arguing not only that the world is less bipolar than it looks, but that a multipolar, a world that is not just US versus Soviet, would be more in the interest of the United States. He moves beyond what would be the classical realist, or at least the neo-realist presumption that bipolarity is more stable. Early on, he's arguing otherwise. That's fundamental to the way Morgenthau thinks of the world. That's fundamental to the way conservatives generally think of overlapping, differentiated centers of power rather than two or three, and overlapping and differentiated judgments of the nature of power. So Kissinger knows very little about China, but sees China as a power center because as a European conservative, he sees the power of Chinese culture. And he sees the legitimacy of Chinese culture, though he rarely understands it very deeply. He sees that as a source of status in the international system and recognizes how a multipolar system, first of all, exists within the bipolarity of the Cold War, and how that multipolarity can actually be a source of stability, management, and negotiation. It's precisely actually what European conservatives are saying at that time. And then the fourth and final area, the one that's always either left out or misunderstood is Kissinger's curious emphasis upon basic principles. And of course, he argues one of the centerpieces of détente in 1972 is the agreement on basic principles between the United States and the Soviet Union. It's very interesting, these principles come up very importantly at the end of the Cold War. Again, Batt's book is very good on this with Brent Scowcroft. The basic principles for Kissinger are European-style international law. We might even call it the beginnings of 21st century thinking about international law. Not the way Americans think about international law, which is about codified documents and enforcement, but instead about creating climates of acceptability, climates of legitimacy. This is actually what Europeans are talking about in the 19th century when they talk about international relations. They're legal scholars. Morgenthau was a classically trained European international relations specialist, trained in what? Trained in law. Right? It's international law that's the basis for the way European conservatives think about the international system. It's really interesting. Both Morgenthau and Friedrich, the men who tutored Kissinger as a young man on international affairs, are both legal scholars, not IR theorists. They are used by IR theorists later, but as far as I can tell, I haven't looked in Friedrich's papers, but I spent a lot of time in Morgenthau's papers. As far as I can tell, neither of them ever had much purchase upon international relations theory, didn't really care about it. For them, it was about international law. Right? And law for them was about creating climates of opinion, creating norms, creating notions of legitimacy. Everything Kissinger writes, he talks about legitimacy. What is legitimacy for him? It's not elections. It's about creating a body of accepted opinion of what is considered appropriate behavior and what is inappropriate behavior. As a European conservative, Kissinger wants the United States to invest less in deterrence and more in creating climates of legitimacy for appropriate behavior in different parts of the world. His notion of legitimacy is not the same as the human rights community's notion in the 1970s. And the way to understand the 1970s, it seems to me, is not to see realism versus human rights advocacy, but to see two different claims of legitimacy on the international system. Right? The human rights advocates are arguing for an individualist claim to certain treatment we all deserve as human beings. The Kissingerians, and I would include Scowcroft in this, are actually arguing not for that. They're arguing for a climate of opinion about the certain behavior of what states should do, what states should be allowed to do, and what states should not be allowed to do. So states should not be invading neighbor states' territory, but they should be managing the smaller states and keeping order in their setting, right? So for Kissinger, the Soviets are behaving in a legitimate way in the 1970s because he believes they're maintaining order in Eastern Europe and elsewhere. He believes Chile is operating illegitimately. This is his belief because he believes the Chilean government is bringing in communist influences into an area where those influences should not be because that's part of America's climate and the United States' climate of control, right? That's how he sees this world. That's how he understands it. You don't have to like it to see its genesis, to see its actual intellectual strength as a way of thinking. It's very powerful for policymaking because it's actually a more actionable set of policy ideas than human rights, right? If you're a large power that is yourself violating human rights in many cases, it's very hard to be an advocate of human rights with consistency. It's much easier, more effective perhaps, he would argue, to be an advocate of international law because law allows much more flexibility, right, than totemic constitutional claims of human rights do as such. That would be Kissinger's argument, at least. Why does all this matter? I don't think this matters because Kissinger's right. I don't think he is. I don't think it matters because his is the only conservative way of thinking. It isn't. I don't think it matters because he's an original thinker. I don't think he is. I think it matters because what he represents is the importation, the imbrication of these ideas into American thinking where they weren't before. And I think his status as the American sage, both hated and loved in American thinking, is because he has this unique purchase on this way of thinking. Why do people want to listen to him? And they still do, right? Not because he's right, not because he tells people what to do, but because he offers an insight on how these ideas can be applied to our world. And that's different from, I would say, the Wilsonian meter and the containment meter that tend to dominate the way we talk about these issues, right? It's an alternative way of thinking. No one else has been able to systematize it either. I think it hasn't been systematized effectively because it doesn't match with the way Americans actually think. I think this was the point that was made by Corey and others in the prior panel. Kissinger's way of thinking is by its nature anti-populist and in some ways anti-democratic, though he would argue it is about a different definition of democracy. So it has always been there as a critique and a point of leverage for those who are looking at a new way of thinking about American policy. But it has never matched up with the ways in which Americans, by any majority, think about these issues. And that's what makes it fundamentally conservative. It's fundamentally skeptical of populism, fundamentally skeptical of popular opinion, and fundamentally invested in tradition and slow change. Thank you.
Well, my task is to discuss Ronald Reagan as conservative internationalist. And I think the first disclaimer, while I'm honored to be doing this and honored that Charlie asked me to fulfill this role, but the first disclaimer is that any number of my fellow colleagues on this panel or at this conference could speak with equal, if not actually quite a bit more authority than me on Reagan. So starting with Brands the Elder, who we'll hear from at lunch, and then Brands the Younger, who we'll hear from as well. You know, both Bill Brands and Hal Brands have written great biographies, great studies of Reagan's foreign policy. Jeremi's forthcoming book on the impossible presidency has a very insightful section on Reagan. Our chair, Sparrow, wrote the authoritative biography of Brent Scowcroft, including a very insightful section on Scowcroft chairing Scowcroft's role of the Tower Commission, which pretty much rescues the Reagan presidency from near impeachment and collapse. Popescu, I could go on and on. So I'm honored to be the guy who got tapped to give the Reagan talk, but at the same time, that makes it all the more daunting, and I look forward to the feedback from others. I do want a couple of our speakers, Frank Gavin earlier and Jeremi Suri today, have both questioned whether a conservative internationalism does exist. I'll just say this. If it does exist, if conservative internationalism does exist as a concept, then Reagan embodies it. If there is the quintessential conservative internationalist, it would be Ronald Reagan. My use there of that phrase, the quintessential conservative internationalist, I'm borrowing from our earlier keynote speaker today, Henry Now, because Reagan is one of the 4 conservative internationalist icons featured in Henry's book. And I just want to read briefly here an excerpt from the book where Henry lays out the case for why Reagan is the quintessential conservative internationalist. His strategy reflected the 3 principal features of conservative internationalism. He ardently advocated the expansion of freedom, not just coexistence with the Soviet Union, and denied moral equivalence to countries like the Soviet Union, which were not yet free. He assertively pursued the buildup of economic and military power to accompany and leverage his diplomacy. And he preferred to work through ad hoc and informal negotiating mechanisms that preserved national sovereignty, rather than formal arms control treaties and universal organizations such as the United Nations that replaced it. So, to start, I'm in fundamental agreement with Henry's assessment. I'm not going to then spend the next 15 minutes, as we professors are wont to do, saying all the ways I think Henry gets that wrong. I think Henry gets that fundamentally right. Amen. But since I do have 15 minutes, rather than just sitting down and saying go read Henry's book, I do want to elaborate on this argument in a few areas, but also, being a good professor, I want to suggest a few ways in which Henry's argument is perhaps incomplete, and ways in which Reagan may have deviated from conservative internationalism, just as Wilson deviated quite a bit from Wilsonianism, perhaps. And I'll just conclude with a couple brief reflections on Reagan's continuing influence on conservative internationalism today, if it does in fact exist. So first, 7 ways that I do think Reagan as a policymaker does embody conservative internationalism, although with some elaborations. The first is his belief in human liberty and in the institutions of political and religious liberty. As Hal Brands shows in his newest book on America's unipolar moment, which is really a very thoughtful, in-depth study of Reagan's foreign policy, Reagan's support for human liberty wasn't just confined to an instrumentalist tactic for delegitimizing the Soviet bloc, but rather did approach a more universalist vision. As Reagan's supporters and detractors are very quick to note, during the 1980s this often meant support for autocratic and authoritarian right-wing regimes as long as they were anti-communist, and that is a strong feature of the Reagan record and Reagan's overall anti-Soviet Cold War policy. However, what is less often appreciated, and this is where Hal's work is very important here, and some of my own forthcoming work I hope will be expanding on this, is that even as Reagan was pursuing a generally pretty confrontational approach to support human rights and eventually democracy within the Soviet Union, behind the Iron Curtain, support for solidarity in Poland, and other anti-communist dissidents. There also were some quiet and then sometimes very public diplomatic efforts to promote human rights and democracy in America's alliance sphere, among America's allies, especially in East Asia. The tactics were somewhat different, but the same vision was there. And this is where I think in some ways it deviates even from conservative internationalism as Henry talks about it, support for democracy at the, and human liberty at the peripheries of the liberal order. That's there with Reagan, but also at places very far afield from the liberal order. As Sam Huntington later pointed out, the 1980s were the third wave of democratization. Well, it really starts in the 70s, but especially comes to fruition in the 1980s, with previously authoritarian right-wing American allies such as South Korea in their transition in 1987, such as the Philippines in their transition in 1986, an imperfect transition as we see with Duterte today, such as Taiwan and their democratic transition in kind of the 87-88 window, all with active Reagan administration support and encouragement. Or in Latin America, Chile's democratization, Brazil's democratization, eventually El Salvador shortly after the Cold War ends. And this is, a lot of these are some of the fruits of Reagan's 1982 Westminster speech and the creation of the National Endowment for Democracy to institutionalize this universalist vision. So I think it's consistent with conservative internationalism, but perhaps even goes beyond it. Second, the importance of ideas, ideology, idealism in the classical sense for Reagan. Ideas as really drivers and shapers of history, not just idealism in contrast with realism. And I think this is really key to understanding Reagan's Soviet policies, particularly his deviation from his critique of détente of the Kissinger-Nixon school, which Jeremi eloquently put out there, his diagnosis of the Soviet Union's fragility born of its fundamental contradictions. So for Reagan's vision of Cold War victory, it started in the realm of ideas, which enabled him to look beyond the prevailing bipolar framework and see the bankruptcy of ideas that the Soviet Union stood on and embodied. And this is, Reagan is remembered as a master of political rhetoric, many, famous turns of phrase in his speeches, but they are best understood as embodying and encapsulating the role of ideas in his foreign policy. So in the 1982 Westminster speech, when he says Marxism, Leninism will end up on the ash heap of history. The next year when he says the Soviet Union, is the embodiment of evil in the modern world, it's the evil empire. Later when he says, tear down this wall. These iconic moments in Reagan's history weren't just artful theater and stagecraft put together by the devious Michael Deaver, although he did play a role in that. But they were, in some ways, the culmination of the role of ideas for Reagan. But here, if anything, I do think that Henry and some other Reagan scholars do underplay the religious dimension of Reagan's idealism. And this is where Reagan is so complicated, because Reagan holds two competing, even contradictory religious impulses in his ideational framework. The first is and they're both eschatological. They're both dealing with the trajectory of history and the future. The first one is the post-millennial optimism about Providence steering history towards a glorious culmination of the flourishing of human liberty. Led by his beloved United States. But the second is this very apocalyptic, dark terror of nuclear holocaust, which he sees embodied in some biblical prophecies in the book of Revelation. And so both of those religious ideas are really central to Reagan's worldview, his makeup, and we see them translated into his policies. And they can't be easily reconciled. But in that sense, Reagan is a typical human being, because who here among you is perfectly consistent, or more me, in the things that we hold on to? Third, a little more briefly, the relationship between force and statecraft, as the scholars Alex George and Gordon Craig memorably put together the classic volume on this, or armed diplomacy, as Henry calls it. And here I think Reagan, and especially his Secretary of State George Shultz, less so his Secretary of Defense Cap Weinberger, did have a conceptual framework for the role of military strength and the implicit threat of force and diplomacy, that they are not antinomies, but rather they're complementary and mutually reinforcing tools. And so, in this case, the Reagan military buildup really facilitated his diplomatic efforts with the Soviet Union. We could perhaps talk a bit more about that in the Q&A. The fourth way, deliberately in contrast with the third one, the relationship between force and statecraft is what we see as restraint in the actual use of force. This is where Reagan is also very interesting, especially in a little bit of contrast to the jingoistic caricature of Reagan as warmonger. This, again, is exemplified by the Weinberger Doctrine and shaped very much by the legacy of Vietnam. So arguably, the Grenada invasion in October of 1983 is the only time that Reagan deploys conventional forces in a combat mission. There were the peacekeeping mission, of course, with the Marines in Beirut, and how tragically that ends, and I'll get to that in a second. But for all the military buildup, for all the belligerent rhetoric, this was not a guy going around invading countries left and right. And he's in office for 8 years. Interesting contrast with his successor, Bush 41, who we'll hear from Josh Shifrinson here, commonly understood as a prudent realist, restrained about the use of force, and yet Bush 41 he invades Panama. Often forgotten, deploys conventional forces there. The massive deployment of conventional forces the next year in the 1989 build-up, the 1990 build-up, and the 1991 Gulf War invasion. Bush 41 even deploys troops in what becomes a combat mission in Somalia in 1992, later expanded and then mishandled by the Clinton administration. But essentially, Bush 41 deploys troops a lot more than Reagan in combat missions in half the time. So it's just an interesting part of the record. And so, if anything, my own critique, if anything, I think Reagan was perhaps sometimes a little too reluctant to use force, most memorably the fact that we never did a real retaliation after either the April '83 bombing of our embassy in Beirut or the October 1983 bombing of the Marine barracks. So there's a real reluctance to actually use force there. Fifth, also following in that, why is Reagan not deploying American combat troops willy-nilly around the globe? Because he has other people doing the fighting for us. Reagan and the use of proxy forces. And so this is a natural follow-on, and this is embodied in the Reagan Doctrine, of course. A natural follow-on to restraint about the use of force is equipping others to do the fighting for us. Again, most memorably with the Mujahideen, or aid to the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, the Contras in Nicaragua, the UNITA rebels in Angola, and other hotspots at the periphery of the Cold War standoff between the United States and the Soviet Union. Some of those used to great effect, others to mixed effect, others with very tragic consequences. Sixth, the importance of allies. I think in some ways this is underappreciated just how much importance the Reagan administration placed on allies. He was no unilateralist. We see this in his the administration's iconic partnerships with the United Kingdom and France and Germany, Japan, Saudi Arabia. Also Reagan's personal relations with leaders like Thatcher and Kohl and Nakasone and Brian Mulroney. So it's a reminder that conservative internationalism is not unilateralism. And there may be a little bit more skepticism about formal multilateral institutions such as the UN, but that should not deter us from seeing the deep reliance on allies as force multipliers, as a source of national power. And Reagan sometimes believed in allies, to a fault. One of the certainly more ignominious episodes in his administration was his visit to the Bitburg Cemetery, where the a number of SS commanders were buried, including ones who had engaged in killing American troops, let alone the Holocaust. And he was strongly warned against this by his aides. It turns into a big crisis. Why did he actually go through and do that? It was because of his personal commitment to Helmut Kohl. He felt like he'd made this commitment to Kohl that you've got to stand by your allies, even when it brings a certain amount of political heat and frankly moral disgrace. But at least to give him credit there, that is born out of a strong commitment to allies. Finally, the seventh aspect, which again much more could be done to develop on Reagan as conservative internationalist, international trade and finance. Interesting to remember with the current administration's hostility to NAFTA, Reagan invented NAFTA. He first called for it in 1980 on the campaign trail, a North American free trade alliance. Reagan presides over the Uruguay round of trade liberalization through the WTO in 1986. A lot more that could be said here. George Shultz, of course, is the real leader in this, although Jim Baker is Secretary of Treasury as well. But this is not just incidental. The commitment to the expansion of free trade, free enterprise globally is very central to Reagan's internationalist vision of economic freedom and political freedom. Finally, three ways where I think Reagan deviates a bit, or maybe a lot, from conservative internationalism. The first would be his nuclear abolitionism. He wanted, very clearly throughout his career, even before he becomes president, certainly well, to abolish all nuclear weapons. Some may see great wisdom and virtue in that, others may see folly in it, but it's not what one would historically associate with conservative internationalism, especially insofar as America's nuclear arsenal does reinforce armed diplomacy and is part of that relationship between force and statecraft. And also, again, a little bit contrary to Henry's interpretation, is, Reagan does believe in formal arms control treaties. He and Gorbachev conclude the INF Treaty, the first time in history that it's not just reducing, but it's abolishing an entire class of nuclear weapons. Second, would be Reagan's willingness to negotiate with terrorists over hostage releases. This is really where the origins of Iran-Contra are. And I think that also sacrifices the principle of armed diplomacy, as well as in so much, I think, his belief in the power of ideas really failed there. And also hurt U.S. credibility. Yeah, there's a lot of unhappy things to say about the Iran-Contra episode, but I'm most interested for our purposes today in how it undermines this otherwise fairly principled stance of conservative internationalism. Third and finally, and something I'd like to explore more in my future work, is what I might call personalism. Even though Reagan operates in a world of nation states, he has almost a pre-modern belief in the individual human person, both prior to and transcending the nation state. And this shapes very much his engagement with international leaders. This is why when he's recuperating in the hospital bed in March of '81 after the assassination attempt, he writes this long personal letter to Brezhnev, reaching out to him as a fellow human being. This is why he's always talking to his aides about what do the Russian people actually think. This is why he becomes so enamored of Suzanne Massey, the kind of iconoclastic gadfly author who had made a number of trips to the Soviet Union, and she was telling him what the Russian people were really thinking. Do they believe in God? Do they want to go to church? Do they believe in America? This is why his famous January 1984 speech on Ivan and Anya, trying to remind the American people that this is not, we don't like the Soviet system, but there's real people over there. And so while the nation state is foundational to the international system that Reagan is operating in, there's this really interesting element of him that, like I said, has almost this pre-modern exaltation of the individual human person outside even of their nation state context or their own nationality. And this, of course, is the key to understanding his diplomacy with Gorbachev, why he is one of the first world leaders to see the potential with Gorbachev, why he tries to appeal to Gorbachev so much as an individual human being, why in 1988, his visit to Moscow, he spent a lot of time essentially witnessing to Gorbachev, trying to persuade him to believe in God. That is not traditional realpolitik. Okay, that is Reagan having this deep human connection, seeing Gorbachev as this fellow human being, almost outside of this geopolitical context. Anyway, I've used up all my time there. I had some other thoughts, but I want to mention two final parting ones on Reagan's legacy for conservative internationalism, if it exists. I do think it does. First, the Reagan administration is a real incubator of talent of future conservative internationalist policymakers who really come of age working for him, spanning the gamut from Colin Powell and Jim Baker to the Scooter Libbys and Paul Wolfowitzes and Doug Weiss of the world. And then finally, Reagan as a GOP icon who, however much he's understood, misunderstood, is still so exalted today that I think he really has set an agenda for 21st century Republican debates over what conservative internationalism is. So with that, we'll turn over to Professor Shifrinson to hear about Reagan's success.
Thank you, Will. Thank you, Jeremy. Unlike the other two speakers on the panel, I'm a political scientist, which means I have no problem arguing about definitions, straw manning competing arguments, and making gross generalizations that may not hold up to scrutiny. So with that in mind, I'm going to focus my talk on two interrelated questions, or at least two questions that I see as intimately interrelated. The first is, was H.W. Bush, as Will rightly teed up, really a conservative internationalist? And then second, more generally, building upon that assessment, what does the H.W. presidency tell us about the utility of conservative internationalism, not as a school of thought for IR, because I think that's really nicely laid out in Henry's books, but as an approach to foreign policy, the tool to foreign policy. So let me take this in turn. To give the answer up front on my first question, No, H.W. Bush was not in any deep sense of the term a conservative internationalist. He was an archetypical realist. Now, that's not, I'm going to highlight elements that are conservative about his foreign policy, that I will concede that point. And I'm going to do this building upon an assessment of his foreign policy vis-a-vis the USSR, closely related to that, his policy towards Europe, especially Eastern Europe and German reunification, and then a subject I know surprisingly little about, so feel free to push back on this, the PRC. And from there I'll turn over to an assessment of his foreign policy legacy. With the USSR, right, let me begin by noting that there are three core elements of conservative internationalism that are really nicely laid out in literature. The first and foremost is that threats are defined predominantly in terms of ideological and regime characteristics of another state. First and foremost. Second, that military force gives a state leverage in foreign policy. This leverage should be used. And that third, finally, diplomacy must favor freedom, calls for freedom over time, even in the face of opposition. I'm going to come back to that last point in just a second. I would argue that on all three scores, H.W. Bush doesn't really match up. And that's not a critique of him, that's what I'll turn to in a moment. With the USSR, we know that by 1988, 1989, that is, as H.W. Bush comes into office, the USSR is no longer seen as an ideological threat. Brent Scowcroft writes a memo that H.W. Bush signs off upon saying the Soviet Union is done as an ideological threat. You couldn't ask for a clearer statement that the regime characteristics that helped cause the Cold War had waned. And even in the IR scholarship, people like Mark Haas, who you heard about this morning, say that the Soviet Union was liberalized and becoming more like the West by the turn of 1988, by the end of 1988. So on these scores, the USSR is changing. Nevertheless, H.W. Bush and Brent Scowcroft and the foreign policy team, I think rightly, say that doesn't change anything. The Soviet Union is still a massively powerful military adversary with great ability to compete, who have interests that conflict in strong ways with ours. That's almost a direct quote. So changes in the Soviet domestic scene, causing it to liberalize, don't actually see the U.S. moderating its behavior towards the USSR. And point number one, the hard-bitten desire to compete is still in the HW administration. This is not a statement that they are focusing on regime characteristics. This is a statement that military power, economic power, pure and simple, with vital interests that, for whatever the reason, that aren't related to regime type or ideology, are causing competition. That's what they're going to focus upon. Point number one. Point number two, when it comes to Germany and Eastern Europe, changes in the fundamental situation in the cockpit of global politics, that's what we called Europe during the Cold War, there's actually not a lot of change in response to reforms on the ground. We know, for example, that in 1989, H.W. Bush, in a speech at Texas A&M, and I'll give a little shout out to my home institution there. Where? Nowhere at all. Says that he calls for a Europe whole and free. This is held up as him calling for freedom and liberty throughout Europe. But we know through Condi Rice's memoir, Phil Zelikow, and now from the declassified documents, that this is seen as a hollow placeholder. Indeed, Bob Zellick says this is a phrase without any meaning. Right? This is a way to avoid having Gorbachev seize the claim of calling for German reunification and therefore making a bid to pull Germany out of NATO. This is not a policy calling for liberalization. It's an effort at neutralizing the issue of European geopolitics to avoid having a conflict with the USSR over Germany as the Cold War is wrapping up. Indeed, this goes further in the course of 1989 when Poland, when Solidarity begins to gain power, when Lech Walesa begins to seek power against the communist regime, which Will just spoke to. And a startling turn of events, the U.S. ambassador on the ground, backed by Bob Blackwell in the White House, Jim Baker in the White House, at Foggy Bottom, and Brent Scowcroft, they sent memos explaining how to have Solidarity members vote Polish communists into office. And the first free elections in Poland since before World War II. Now they do this because there's a great concern that if Solidarity takes power, that is, if these liberal forces overturn the status quo in Europe, you will see Soviet tanks roll into the country in a replay of 1956 and 1968. This is not a statement that H.W. Bush sought to promote liberalism, at least in any real long-term sense of the phrase. If you are going to vote communists into office in free and fair elections, you are according them a legitimacy that they would not otherwise hold. Then, as we see Germany begin to reunify, the archival evidence is very, very clear. H.W. Bush is focused on one thing and one thing only, called keeping West Germany in NATO. Hard stop, turn the page. If that requires slowing down German reunification, allowing some kind of placeholder communist government in the former East Germany, indeed even coercing Helmut Kohl on this issue, then so be it. And it takes until February 1990, several months after the Berlin Wall has fallen, for H.W. Bush to sign up for a foreign policy calling for German reunification. And he does so only because Helmut Kohl eats the very large concession that German reunification will not occur at the expense of Germany's NATO ties. Point number 2. And then finally, when it comes to the People's Republic of China, we all remember Tiananmen Square and the protesters and the tanks rolling through the streets. H.W. Bush, and again, we can evaluate the merits of this approach, but H.W. Bush refuses in the face of calls to break off diplomatic relations with this country, taking quite a bit of heat in the process. Now, it's a horrible thing to watch protesters be gunned down, but he does so, and the archival evidence is very clear, because he's aware that if you foreclose communication, that if you simply hold the regime responsible for its dastardly deeds at home, you foreclose the possibility of improving relations over time and using diplomatic connections to actually encourage liberalization from within. This is a statement of you have to sacrifice short-term focus on the regime for a long-term focus on geopolitical and strategic interest. Point number 3. So on all these 3 metrics, it doesn't seem like George H.W. Bush is focusing and acting as a conservative internationalist. This is a man who's focused on the military threat, who's focused on keeping alliances intact, who's focused on keeping diplomatic relations with a big important power intact, even and is willing to do so even if it requires sacrificing liberal values broadly defined. So what does this mean for the utility of conservative internationalism as a tool of foreign policy? Not as a way of understanding foreign policy, mind you, as a tool of foreign policy. Well, it seems to me that this actually is a clarion call for the value of realpolitik, Kissingerian-style realpolitik. And let me build that out a little bit. By many accounts, the H.W. presidency is the gold standard for foreign policy. That's not my term. I think it's a pretty big historical consensus. It's the team-based presidency. This is a point in time when the unipolar era is incorporated, very closely followed thereafter by the incorporation of American hegemony in Europe and Asia. And at the same time, when we see economic and military, American economic and military vitality flourish around the world. On all 3 points, it seems to me, H.W. Bush's foreign policy plays a very large role. It is not hard to understand, for example, how if H.W. Bush had focused on embracing Gorbachev's reforms, we would not have seen the breakup of the USSR, as we eventually did. It, in fact, requires the U.S. stepping back from embracing Gorbachev's reforms inside the USSR to continue keeping pressure on Soviet reformers, on communism, despite the Gorbachev reforms, that facilitates the USSR's breakup and thus creates the conditions behind which American unipolarity can flourish. Likewise, H.W. Bush, it doesn't take a lot to imagine that if H.W. Bush had called for revolts in Eastern Europe or had embraced German reunification on any terms, that is, embraced the liberalizing mission of American foreign policy over other interests in American foreign policy, one would either have seen a Soviet crackdown in Eastern Europe, one might have seen forces going on alert in Germany amidst the changes of reunification, and indeed it's not hard to imagine that one might have seen NATO collapse as Germany traded NATO alignment for reunification, or had embraced Soviet calls to build equally mutually reinforcing collective security apparatus in Europe as the Warsaw Pact itself began to fade. And essentially, H.W. Bush keeps NATO and the vehicle by which American power is projected into Europe alive even into the post-Cold War world. Point number 2. And then finally, point number 3, it's not as unpleasant as it might be to have relations with the PRC in 1989 and thereafter. Let's also not forget that by keeping relations with the PRC intact, it facilitated an economic boom across China, which has raised many people out of poverty. It facilitated greater standards of living in the United States. And though President Trump may call against free trade and trade pacts, by many accounts, it facilitated a China that has joined the Western, has been more enthusiastic of liberal order than would otherwise be the case. It is not hard to imagine how a PRC that had been isolated, that had been castigated, and that had been had seen diplomatic relations broken off in 1989 and thereafter, would have been would have been more inclined to try to subvert the American-led order than it has been to date. This is not to say that China is a friend or an ally today. Something that the counterfactual is worse than what it is. So on all these points, it seems to me, conservative internationalism has great utility, but we shouldn't forget that realpolitik has recently, that is in living memory, provided us some goods in U.S. foreign policy. And simply saying that there are conservative principles that realpolitik sacrifices, or American principles that realpolitik sacrifices, does not in and of itself discredit the approach. I think with that in mind, we can move forward and try to evaluate how these different tools, how these different concepts provide insight into how the United States should manage its role in the world going forward, and how we can understand the American role in the world in the past. And with that, I'll step down.
Let me start by using my prerogative as chair to just ask a question of each of three, and I don't have a question that I can ask all three of them at once, so let me just, because I really enjoyed the papers, I thought they're all really very insightful and valuable. Let me start in order. I guess my question to Jeremi is, you talk about Kissinger and his conservatism, and I take your point. I think that's what is really valuable what you say. But you think of sort of what's going on in the 70s, in fact, going back arguably to Goldwater and certainly increases in the 80s and 90s, is you have sort of the movement conservative, and the conservative that does not believe in population control, that does not believe in abortion, that does not believe in sound fiscal policy, that says, in fact, supply-side economics, and really push anti-government, anti-regulation at all costs, not anti-environment, or arguably anti-environment effectively, unlike Teddy Roosevelt. So my question to you then is, if you can see that there are these splits in the Republican Party, to what degree is your analysis of sort of a historical and intellectual history analysis, and what bearing does it have us on now thinking about conservatism, given how the party and ideology has evolved? My question for Will is, again, I thought it was a terrific paper, and what I was wondering is, one of the things that I think Jeremi concluded on, which is absolutely sound, is that both with certainly Nixon, with Kissinger, arguably Skorotkov, there's a real skepticism of democracy. And this is what you have in the movement conservatism. You actually have this populism, and you have that, and rather than involved in this public rhetoric and so forth, rather than not wearing religion on your sleeves, rather than being sort of quiet or talk softly and carry a big stick and so forth. So my question to Will is, it seems to me that you think of support for Iraq, you think of certainly a lot of the Cold War activities behind the Iron Curtain, military exercises, and there's a great deal of covert action. This is a way that ostensibly democratic policymakers are a way of saying, okay, well, we're going to act in the public interest, but we're also going to act in the American interest, and if we think that the public is a little leery of this, or going to do things, then we're going to do this surreptitiously. And now, I was hearing someone the other day saying that the size of special forces of the United States is larger than all of the British active military service. Just how large either the contractors or CAA or special ops with the branches of the military are. So suggesting kind of just how a part of this is to, and it seems to me to be a little bit of a challenge to the idea of sort of democracy and of this popular aspect of certainly Reagan. Now my question for Josh, and again, I thought it was wonderful, and I really don't disagree. In fact, I would say that a lot of what he says is in the book, I
didn't do good citations.
No, but I was just saying that I really endorse you pushing these issues and developing some of these arguments further. I should write some more standalone articles on that. But I was wondering is that it seems that there is with Bush a quieter side. Is actually what you're going to as China is that there's very much a huge economic dimension to China and the PRC. They're aware, yes, there could be a bamboo curtain. Yes, they're aware that China could go back to another cultural revolution. But I think they're kind of overselling that. They also very much aware of this huge market, huge opportunities. And the same with the collapse of the Soviet Union in Eastern Europe. They're aware that this is actually because Europe has the advantage. They're aware that this is a potential area of investment, of trade, and so forth. NAFTA, of course, is a big part of that. NAFTA came up earlier, and what a boon it is. Well, you have estimates between 4 and 6 million Mexican farmers who have been dislocated because of what is going on, especially the prices of corn, but also other prices of goods, and the impact of NAFTA, and that, of course, feeding some of the border pressures and the immigration to the United States. So I guess I would say that I think on economic issues, he's very much a continuer of Reagan, and seeing his kind of minimal government. And he sort of does some lip service to the environment, but he has to protect his wing. And there, he's kind of very much this kind of new style conservative of promoting kind of the market as a sign of really sort of ultimately U.S. presence, continued influence worldwide.
So a great question, Bat, and as you and everyone else knows, I mean, there's a tremendous amount of really good scholarship written by a whole range of historians and political scientists about the rise of the new right in the United States. It used to be 10 years ago, everyone studied the rise of the left, now everyone studies the rise of the right in the United States. I wonder why. And the scholarship on the rise of the right points to exactly what you said. The prominence of religious issues, the prominence of identity issues, and most significantly, to your question, the prominence of Kissinger as an adversary, as an enemy. He is the one that people on the right are mobilizing people against, especially when they talk about foreign policy. Exhibit A is Ronald Reagan himself. Ronald Reagan's speeches in the early 80s, the ones he writes by hand, which I think are actually quite impressive, they are filled with Kissinger as adversary. At one point I counted...
Or you mean in the 70s, right?
70s.
Okay, it's the 80s.
I meant the 70s, I'm sorry. One's in his hand in the 70s. The radio addresses. At one point I counted, and there are almost as many negative references to Kissinger as there are to the Soviet Union in those addresses, right? Now part of that is Kissinger's the person in power. Kissinger is associated with Ford, of course. So in many ways, Kissinger is the antithesis of what the new right is. And I would argue that his power, his continuing influence and presence among Reagan, among Bush, among many others going forward, and the reason he has resonance today is because even those who have those views and might reject on moral terms what he does, when they get into power, they see the importance of his perspective. They don't necessarily agree with it. But the European conservative approach to political change and policy making has a certain weight, a certain gravity. Because what you find when you're in office immediately, and this came up in the first panel, is that you have large ideals and you have large principles that are motivating you, but you have the realities of power, which are much stickier, much more difficult. And the power of a European conservative point of view is that it addresses that question. How do you manage the complexity of these issues that don't match your principles as such? I think that's why people turn to Kissinger. He has never been of the new right. And the last point I'll make on this is I think it's hilarious to get accounts of his meetings with Sarah Palin. He met with her twice, actually. And you want to talk about two people missing each other in the night. Of course, she wanted to be associated with Kissinger. Kissinger wanted to be associated with her. But there was no serious dialogue at all.
Let me, before we get right to Bat's question, I just want to elaborate a little bit on Jeremy's comments on the Kissinger-Reagan relationship, which really is fascinating, as Jeremy says. And one, the big dimension which Jeremy's talked about is Reagan's rejection of a lot of Kissinger's ideas, but there's also Reagan's personal rejection of Kissinger institutionally. And this is why I found a fascinating memo in Reagan's 1980-81 campaign transition papers where they're talking about how we're going to set up the Reagan National Security Council, and really the main and only reason why they set it up with Dick Allen as the National Security Advisor demoted first time since Mack Bundy that national security advisors are not reporting directly to the president, rather has to be demoted, kicked down in the basement of the West Wing, reporting through the troika of Deaver, Meese, and Baker, is because they don't want another Henry Kissinger. That they say, we do not want another Henry Kissinger. We don't want the Kissinger NSC. Now that arrangement doesn't work, and they eventually go back. But then the other thing, as much as Reagan does have that general rejection of the Kissinger worldview, the big exception is Reagan's China policy. And that's where, even sort of looking at kind of the settlement that Reagan and Deng Xiaoping concluded in 1982 is really just codifying the Kissingerian framework of China as essentially stabilizing partner to help balance the USSR for the US in the Cold War. That's why when Reagan goes to China in 1984, notwithstanding what I've talked about Reagan's universalist vision for democracy and human rights, he does hardly anything on democracy and human rights in China. Again, following the Kissingerian framework there, even though he probably didn't want to attribute it to him. But so that's true. Anyway, briefly on Matt's question.
Did he? I don't know the answer. Did he consult with Kissinger before his trip to China?
I don't know. It's a great question. Yeah, it's a great question. So, but it sounds like he didn't need to because he knew what Kissinger would want. Yeah. So anyway, well, going back to the archives in August, I'll let you know what I find. On Matt's question about perhaps the paradox between a belief in democracy, in the consent of the governed, and transparency and limited government, and then say Reagan's use of covert action and some of the lack of transparency. Is that more or less the question?
Yeah, more or less.
Okay, yeah. So here, it is important to remember that Reagan doesn't believe in direct democracy. He believes in representative democracy. He believes in republicanism with a small r. And so that, at this point, that does not mean that people have the right to know everything. It's not until after Reagan leaves the governorship of California in '74. It's not until 1978 that direct democracy hits its apotheosis in California with Proposition 13 limiting the property taxes, and that's when you start to see the early vestiges of populism starting to run amok. But also, another ongoing tension throughout the Reagan administration is between the executive and legislative over power and authority and who has control, who has the lead on foreign policy. And this is where one way of understanding the Iran-Contra is a contest over executive legislative control. Most Reagan administration, President Reagan himself, didn't think the Bolin amendments were legal, and that Congress does not have the constitutional authority to be micromanaging American foreign policy like this. But it's kind of like with the War Powers Act. No administration acknowledges its legitimacy or legality, but they're worried enough about losing the Supreme Court that they'll never take it up there. So that's why it's in this netherworld. So again, with Congress being the main oversight body, the main expression of popular will on foreign policy, the Reagan administration had some reticence about Congress's role there too. So that's in some ways how I guess I would explain some of those tensions. Oh, and finally, I should say, Reagan administration wasn't transparent with itself either. I mean, this was you've heard me say before, Reagan had this great line, my administration is so disorganized that the right hand doesn't know what the far right hand is doing. So SDI, when Reagan rolls that out in March of 1983, George Shultz doesn't learn about it until he gets a call that when he's the Secretary of State, he doesn't know that Reagan's rolling this thing out. Cap Weinberger learned about it the day before. It's just something that Reagan and Bud McFarlane and Bill Clark and a couple of renegade scientists and a couple of guys at the Pentagon sort of cook up. So this was not an administration transparent with itself, let alone with the rest of the country. So,
great. It's a good question. To what extent was H.W. Bush really committed to small government, and to what extent that colored his foreign policy? And here I agree with you. I think he is not nearly as pro-small government as his predecessor, of course. Very few people are at the time. But H.W. Bush is very much a believer in using limited means to create opportunity, right? And to that extent, he does embody conservative principles. And we see, for example, when you talk about Eastern Europe, the Fund for Polish and Hungarian and more broadly defined East European democracy is very much predicated upon private economic activities and the U.S. facilitating private economic engagement in Eastern Europe. Moreover, I'll take it a step further. What you do see a conservative, small c element in H.W. Bush is a reticence to change the status quo. And this becomes very obvious when it comes to NATO, when it comes to limiting the U.S. role in Europe and Asia. And I think here there's a little more wiggle room to see him as a conservative. And in other words, in the tools he uses to engage in the foreign policy that he has chosen. Here, as I mentioned, he's very much believe in the status quo, but also in creating, for lack of a better term, boundary conditions, right? Once you can eliminate the Warsaw Pact, you then have the opportunity to see how facts on the ground evolve. If you want to then expand NATO, if you want to use the promise of NATO expansion as a tool to encourage East European reform along American liberal small L value lines. Likewise, it creates opportunities for U.S. foreign economic investment. And I'll tell a story here from the archives that is kind of just fun. Mark Palmer, who had been one of Reagan's key advisors on basically East European liberation, went to Europe in late 1980s as ambassador, retires in start of 1989. He stays in Europe. And then towards the end of 1989, after the Berlin Wall has fallen, then private citizen Mark Palmer, retired ambassador Mark Palmer, comes to the H.W. Bush administration with an initiative to help redevelop Berlin, right? The area around the Berlin Wall and Checkpoint Charlie and all these opportunities. And they start doing a little background work, and it turns out Palmer, through a European consortium, has bought up a lot of land in that area. And the government goes, no, we're not going to touch this one. This is a bad idea. And so there's an element of reticence to muck about too much and just see how facts on the ground evolve, even when doing so, even in the face of internal calls.
Questions for me?